So as Vanessa says, I'd like to talk today about why I think behavioural science is so important for advertisers, but also maybe look at why isn't it more widely adopted? What are the objections to behavioural science? So I thought the best place to start might be how I first came to realise why behavioural science was so useful. And that was quite a long time back. It was in 2003, 2004, when I was working on the Give Blood account. I was a media planner, and one of our clients was the NHS. And we were struggling at the time because we weren't getting enough blood donations. And it was then that I came across this wonderful story that really got me interested in behavioural science. And it's the story of Kitty Genovese. So Genovese was a bar worker in New York, and one night, March the 13th, 1964, she was coming home, 3 a.m. in the morning. And as she parked her car, a couple hundred yards from her apartment, she gets out and starts walking towards her front door. And unfortunately, as she's walking, Winston Moseley, who is a serial killer, spots her. Now, he attacks her on the street, stabs her, and then for some reason, he panics. He drops the knife and he runs off. Genovese struggles to her front door, but in the couple of minutes that it takes her to get there, Moseley's regathered his thoughts, plucked up his courage, and he's come back and he's murdered Kitty Genovese. He stabbed her to death. Now, in 1964, New York was not a safe place. There were 636 other murders in the city that year. But only Kitty Genovese's murder made the front pages of the New York Times. And the reason it made the front pages was because the New York Times claims that supposedly there were 37 witnesses who saw this attack and did nothing to intervene. Now, the New York Times were horrified. They said it was a sickening sign that New York had gone to the dogs, that there was moral decay. But two psychologists, Bibb Latané and John Darley, thought that the New York Times had come to completely the wrong conclusion. That actually, people hadn't intervened not despite there being 37 witnesses, but they hadn't intervened because there were 37 witnesses. There was a diffusion of responsibility. So the psychologists spent the next 3 or 4 years working on a series of experiments. What the experiments basically revolve around was staging an emergency, and they would make sure that emergency was either viewed by one person or a group of people. And then they recorded how likely an individual was to go and help. And they found that invariably, people were far more likely to help if they were on their own rather than in a group. Now, the psychologists called this the bystander effect. They said that there's a diffusion of responsibility. The more people you ask, the less likely any one individual is to help. And when I came across this story, I thought, bloody hell, this is exactly the problem we're facing on the blood service. We're going out and we're saying to everyone, please give blood. And of course, just as Latané and Darley suggest, most people ignore us. They think, well, why should I go through the time and the inconvenience of donating when I know everyone else has been asked? So all I did was go and talk to the creative agency and say to them, look, I've discovered this, heard about this bias called the bystander effect. Why don't you change your creative? Why don't you stop saying blood stocks are low in the UK, please donate, and instead let's regionalise and tailor the creative? So we go out and say, blood stocks are low in Birmingham, please donate. Blood stocks are low in Brentwood, please donate. Blood stocks are low in Basildon, please donate. Making the listener or the reader feel like they had been personally appealed to. And the results were clear. A couple of weeks later, we got back the cost response details, and they'd improved by 10, 15%. A very simple application of a 50-year-old bias had improved the marketing I was working on. And I thought after running this test that actually started to get more interested in behavioural science, started to read up more about it. And what I realised was that for 3 big reasons, it was applicable to lots and lots of brands, not just the NHS. And I think it's so relevant for all brands for 3 reasons. So firstly, it's robust. It's not based on the opinion of the most eloquent person in the room. It's based on the peer-reviewed evidence of some of the leading scientists, so people like Daniel Kahneman, Leon Festinger, B.F. Skinner. And not only is it based on their peer-reviewed work, all those experiments in the public domain, we don't have to take them on trust alone. We can go out and replicate them. But secondly, it's also remarkably relevant. It's the science of decision-making, the science of behaviour change. And after all, everything we do as marketers is really about changing behaviour. We want people to pay a little bit more, we want them to switch brands from competitors, or we want them to buy more regularly. All of it involves behaviour change. And then the third strength is the vast range of different biases and insights from psychology. So advertising is a phenomenally varied thing. How can there possibly be one theory that works in all circumstances, that works if you're putting up a poster to find a lost cat or you're trying to lobby the government to build a runway? How can you have one theory of advertising that solves all those problems? And that's the real strength of behavioural science, that it's not one big meta-theory, it's lots of little biases. And you can pick the bias that you think is most relevant for the problem that you're facing. So hopefully, those 3 reasons are quite compelling reasons about why we should be using behavioural science. But you're probably thinking, well, if it's so good, why aren't more people using it? And again, I think there are a few objections. So the first one that I've found over the last few years is people say, well, I'm not affected by these biases, so why should consumers be? And because of that concern, with Newsworks, I ran a very small experiment. I sent you all a survey, and about 100, 150 of you answered that survey. And there are a few little tests, hopefully to show that we're all susceptible to these biases, not just consumers. So the first question was, how good at your job are you compared to your peers? Now, if all things being equal, 50% of you should have said below average, 50% should have said above average. However, there's a bias in psychology called overconfidence. We all think we're better than average. And guess what? 96% of you. And by the way, I've done this probably a dozen times, and I've never got 96%. Normally high 80s, so we can feel proud that we're the most overconfident group that I've ever dealt with. So 96% of you thought you were better than your peers at your job. We are not good witnesses to our own behaviour. There's a wonderful psychologist called Timothy Wilson who says we are strangers to ourselves. But that wasn't the only test I did. You hopefully didn't realise that there were 2 surveys that were sent out. Half of you received one, half the other. Now, one of the questions in that survey was about apples. And I said to half of you, how many calories do you think an apple has? More or less than 50? So people then put yes or no. Sorry, more or less. And then the next question was, well, how many calories do you think an apple has? And in that scenario, people estimated an apple had 67 calories. Now, the test comes in the other half of the survey. So the other half of people were asked, how many calories do you think an apple has? More or less than 150. So they answered, ticked more or less. And then they were asked, well, how many calories do you think an apple has? Have a guess. Now, what do you think people answered? Anyone want to have a guess? Sorry, so for the 150 answer? 200. So much higher. So it's not quite that high, but it's 94. So there's a full 40% increase in the calories that people estimated. So this is an example of something called anchoring. It's an idea that Kahneman and Tversky came up with in 1974, where they said that if you throw out a number, however irrelevant, however spurious, it affects people's thoughts afterwards. That they may realise the number is irrelevant, but they don't adjust enough. So even though whether you're asked beforehand whether an apple has 50 or 150 calories, should have absolutely no effect. The sheer fact of mentioning that number meant there was a swing in of 40% in the guess. So the biases do have an effect, and they do have an effect on us. But of course, some of you are probably thinking, well, okay, that's all very nice, it's a little parlour trick, but we're not interested in these academic ideas. What we want to do is sell stuff. You know, we work in a hard-nosed commercial environment. So what does it matter if in a little survey people guess differently? Well, the reason it matters is I would argue some of the most successful campaigns have been built on the application of biases. And in fact, the most successful campaign ever is partially built on the bias of anchoring. So what do people think the most successful campaign ever is? Any thoughts? Well, so I think we've had a Marmite and maybe there was an apple. I would argue we should go back a little bit further, back to the 1930s. And I would argue the most successful campaign ever is De Beers. Now, it was successful for a couple of reasons. Back in the 1930s, people were as used to, or were as regularly buying sapphire rings or emerald rings or ruby rings as they were diamond ones. So the first thing De Beers did brilliantly was a wonderful bit of copywriting. They forged the link between the durability of a diamond ring and the everlasting nature of true love. So brilliant line from 1947, Francis Geraghty, a diamond is forever. And if you think about it, that link is a little bit strange. Normally, if we want something durable, you know, that's great for a car or some cooking pans. You don't really want it in a romantic object. But that wonderful bit of copywriting managed to link the two things. But getting people to think that diamonds were the natural choice for an engagement ring was only half the job. The next bit of the job was persuading people to pay a lot of money. So De Beers used the principle of anchoring. They went out and they said, you should pay a month's salary. That's the norm. That's what everyone else does. Now, what this did, people knew that they shouldn't really listen to a salesman, that a salesman had a vested interest in trying to get them to spend as much. They knew that maybe a month was a little bit punchy. So therefore they thought, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll only spend 3 weeks' salary. You know, but they spent more, although they didn't think that the month was the right amount. But when De Beers realised that this use of anchoring got people to spend more, when it got to the 1960s, they started to think, well, maybe we could make more of this. So they went out and they said, do you know what? The last 30 years, we've made a little mistake and we've been telling you that you should be spending a month's salary. You should be spending 2 months' salary. And again, people know that 2 months is too much. 8 weeks is too much. 8 weeks of their salary. But they went and started spending 6 or 7 weeks of their salary. The anchor affected how much they paid. And actually, that isn't even the end of the story. In the 1980s, De Beers launched in Japan. And in Japan, there's no heritage of buying diamond rings. So they could start with a new anchor. And they went out and they said, do you know what? You should spend 3 months of your salary on an engagement ring. And again, people were influenced by that anchor. So behavioural science is certainly not just an academic discipline. It can affect everything from strategy to media planning to buying to pricing. But when people start to maybe agree with that, the next issue that people state is, well, okay, that's all very well and good, but the example you've given, you know, this is the 1940s. You know, people have changed. We've had the internet. People are different now. It doesn't really work any longer. And again, it's just not true. Some of the most successful launches of the last 20 years have been based on behavioural science ideas. So one idea from behavioural science is about price relativity. So it's quite related to anchoring. And it's the idea that consumers don't really have a conception of value. They don't know what a fair price is in and of itself. They don't walk around thinking, well, I'm going to pay £1 per unit of happiness. Instead, they think, well, what did I pay for something similar, or what did I pay for the same good last time? Now, what that means is if a brand can shift its competitive set, it changes the price of the things that it's compared to. It changes its sense of value. Now, the brand that did that best is not actually Dow Egberts, it's Nespresso. But the reason I mentioned Dow Egberts is when Nespresso launched, what they didn't do was go out and launch in half-kilo bags like Nespresso or Taylor's of Harrogate's. You didn't see them nestled up in the shelf next to those kind of £5 half-kilo bags. And the reason they didn't do it is because if Nespresso charged the same as it did now, but sold in half-kilo bags, do you know how much it would cost? Any guesses? £37. £37 for a bag of coffee. No one in their right mind would spend £37, however nice the coffee was. What Nespresso did instead, though, was they sold it in little pods, and the pods gave a cup serving. So in a cup serving, the natural comparison set is coffee shops. So people suddenly think, well, I can spend 20 pence on this little pod, or I can spend £2.50 at Caffè Nero. It's amazingly good value. Now, the price of the coffee is exactly the same, whether it's 37 quid in the bag or 20 pence in a pod. But the way it has been sold changes the comparison set, and psychologists have long known that changes the benchmark we use to decide what's good value, and therefore how much people are prepared to pay. So those are just a couple of examples from a book. But the one I wanted to end on was one which is perhaps most relevant to the next panel. And that's about the idea of context, something that I think we ignore far too often. Now, lots of great advertisers through the past have realised the power of context. Now, one in particular was Jeremy Bullmore. So Jeremy Bullmore was the brilliant creative and chairman of JWT, and he came up with this thought experiment. He said, imagine that you see a line of copy, and it says, ex-governess seeks occasional evening work. Now, even if the words stay the same, the words don't matter. What we say doesn't matter. It's what the listener or the reader hears or sees that matters. And that is dependent on the context. And Bullmore says, well, if you saw that in the chaste columns of Britain's oldest women's magazine, The Lady, it would mean one thing. But if you saw that sentence in a grubby little bit of paper in a grubby news agency in King's Cross, then the sentence suddenly means something very different. The context shapes what we take from the message. Now, that's not just anecdote. Michael Depp at the University of Munster did a wonderful experiment. He got people together and he showed them headlines. And he showed them headlines in two different versions, either in a kind of well-respected environment or in a low-respected environment. So he changed the title that was used. And he got those people to score the believability of the headline out of 7. Now, when the headline was in a low-trust environment or low-respected environment, people gave it 1.9 out of 7 in terms of believability. But when it was in a high-trust environment, people gave it 5.5 out of 7 on average in terms of trust and believability. The environment and the context had far more influence in that circumstance than the actual message itself. I worry too often that longer-term effect is not being measured, and therefore we're not planning accordingly. So those were just 3 or 4 biases. Hopefully, if you are ever trying to get people to donate blood, sell diamond rings, sell coffee, or maybe even get a job as a governess, then they've been useful. But the book in your bag has 25 other biases and all the practical applications that come from it. And hopefully, you'll read through it and think about how those biases can be applied to the practical applications, the practical problems you're facing. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. Again, we've got a little bit of time for questions if anyone has any. I, as always, will have one. So I don't know, anyone else? Any questions for Richard? I'm peering out. Fine, I've got one. If short-termism, which we've all touched on a little bit here, overlooks this kind of science behind consumer choice because it's so focused on the when right now, how can we kind of go about addressing this disconnect?
Well, I think it comes back to measurement, and the danger is if we only capture short-term sales, then invariably people get influenced by that. There's a wonderful idea from economics called the Cobra effect. And the idea essentially is that once you set a metric, it has perverse consequences. So why it's called the Cobra effect is back in colonial India, there was a governor who realised there were far too many deaths from cobra bites, people getting poisoned. So he very sensibly set up a bounty. He says, bring in a dead cobra skin and I will give you 5, 10 rupees, whatever it was. So he sets up a metric for success. You know, dead snake skins and then people get the money. And at first it looks like the scheme is working really well. People kept on coming in, giving him loads and loads of cobra skins. But in the long term, there was no solution to the problem. More and more people were still dying. And what he discovered was that people were farming cobras and then they were killing them and bringing in the dead bodies. So he then rescinds the bounty and actually then makes the situation worse. People just release the cobras and there's even more poisonings than there ever were before. And I think there's a really similar analogy there with marketing at the moment, that our Cobra effect is we are setting really short-term targets and then, well, of course, the intelligence of everyone involved tries to hit those targets and they game the system and they deliver against the metric, but not the underlying need, which is long-term profitable growth.
We have a question here from Nick.
Hi, Nick Hewitt from The Guardian. Richard, you work for an agency group that spent squillions in the last few years chasing audiences around the web, regardless of context. What haven't we...
Yeah.
Not you personally.
Yeah. Can I just clarify, I'm not John Wren. So,
but what haven't we done to convince the people who you work with that that isn't necessarily the right approach?
Okay, well, I think it's a really interesting question. I think maybe it relates to Stephen Woodford's question from the last session. And again, it's, well, people know that short-term is a problem. Why aren't they changing behaviour? And I'm not necessarily talking about my company, I'm talking about in general. But I think it comes down to this idea of the principal agent problem. So it's an idea from economics that an MIT professor called Stephen Ross came up with. And what he says is there is a divergence of interest between the agent, that is the employee or the marketer, and the principal, which is the brand or the company. And one is interested, company is interested in long-term profitable growth, but the agent, the marketer, or the employee, is interested in something else. They're interested in their career progression. So what they know is that they want to see short-term results. Now, I would take this, I think there's almost a positive here, because what I really care about, I don't care about general advertisers being successful, I care about the clients I have being successful. So I think you can go to people and say, well, look, everyone knows there's a short-termist problem. Most people will never do anything about this because they will be acting on their own personal interests. You have an amazing opportunity to be distinctive, to stand out, and therefore reap long-term growth. And if you do that, and you can persuade your brand and seniors that the benefits are going to come in that slightly longer term, then I think the rewards could be remarkable.
Thank you.
Cheers.